Today we're going to talk about gender socialization. There are 3 different questions that we're going to talk about today. The first one of these is to begin to think about how we can interpret sociologically how we act as men and women. Second question is, what does it mean to say that certain forms of masculinity or femininity are hegemonic? And the third thing we'll talk about is, what is patriarchy? Okay, we've talked about the socialization process and that we learn through the socialization process how to be human beings. But we also learn through this process how to be men and women. And our gender socialization is one of the most pervasive forms of socialization that we have in our culture today. We learn not just to be human beings, but we learn how to act as either a man or a woman. Before we begin, I want to give a couple of basic definitions of gender and the gender process. Gender is the patterning of difference and domination through distinctions between women and men. Several important ideas about this: that there are patterns, that there's difference created between men and women, and that there is domination that exists as a result of these kinds of distinctions. We all know the concept of gender, but here's another concept that I think is also extremely important that we don't tend to think about in the same kind of way, and that is the process of gendering. That is gender as a verb. In other words, gendering is the patterned ways of distinguishing and differentially evaluating men and women. It's a process. Gender is not something that you either are or you aren't, but actually is a process that is undertaken daily in the course of creating our own self-identity and in the course of coming up against certain social institutions and social structures. We learn who we are as men and women from the socialization process. We learn through internalizing the expectations of society. We take on cultured messages about gender as our own. We replay certain sexual scripts all the time. But we also learn these things from certain gendered structures. There are external rewards and punishments for how we act as men and women. For all these things that we're going to be talking about, it's important to see that there's both social distinctions that are made in our culture, that these are patterned and recreated and reproduced in a number of different ways, and that there is indeed and unfortunately hierarchy still that exists, although it's changing and shifting in form, between that which we consider and label men and that which we consider and label women. Now, the other important point about gender is that in our culture, gender distinctions are very distinct and very rigid. That is, your self-identity is either as a man or as a woman, and not as a little bit of both. Or it's extremely difficult to maintain that kind of little bit of both if you do in our culture. The idea is that there is gender polarization. In our culture, the notion of gender polarization is the idea that women and men are opposite from each other. They're not just different, but they are in many ways opposite. They're also mutually exclusive categories. As I just said, you can't be just a little bit of both. And third, there are only 2 categories in our culture. Now, what I'm about to show you is that, indeed, when we look at actual biology, which we tend to believe is the foundation for this distinct gender polarization, we find that really, in actual fact, the biological differences aren't really all that great. Let's look at this first slide. When we are in the womb, up till about 9 weeks of development, the internal sexual organs of both the biological male and the biological female look extremely similar. In fact, they are similar. We all are born with the exact same external and internal biological structures. Humans actually have the potential for both sex organs from this very early age. What tends to happen is once you reach a certain point of development in the womb, certain biological and chemical changes are triggered that cause one set of internal and external organs to atrophy and go away, and the others to develop and grow. But in actual fact, what we find is that except for a few different cultural a few different biological chemical changes, there is great possibility that we can be a little bit of both. With just a little bit of a wrong chemical change, what looks like a clitoris could actually be a small penis, or what looks like an enlarged clitoris could be a small penis. There are actually 2,000 to 3,000 births a year with ambiguous external genitals. That is, when the doctor looks inside and decides whether or not you're male or female. Sometimes what they're seeing is an enlarged clitoris, sometimes what they're seeing is a small penis. A lot of times these internal ambiguities don't show up until puberty. There is what's known as androgen insensitivity syndrome, when you're actually born with the chromosomes of a male, but you're insensitive to androgens, so the external female organs develop, and you grow up as a woman, but it's not until you get to puberty that suddenly you're not menstruating, and they sort of go in to figure out what's wrong, and they find that, wow, look, you've got internal testes that just haven't descended, and that clitoris is really just a very small penis, but this person is growing up as a girl. It used to be that doctors would keep this a secret when they discovered this, because it was considered to be such a horrible thing for people to discover. But what they're actually now finding is that maybe it's better to wait and see how people want to grow up, or at least to see how things are going before they start to assign one of the other sex to somebody. As much as 15% of the population is technically intersexed. That is, they actually are biologically a little bit of both. Now, what does this mean? Obviously, it throws into great question our notion that sex is something that's completely determined by our biology. When we begin to look at how we are raised socially, we begin to see the pervasiveness of how our society polarizes men and women into complete opposites and gives us our sex characteristics. What we also begin to look at things like hormones and use those to explain, if it's not chromosome, use hormones to explain how we act as men or women. And we all hear discussion about the hormones for aggression, testosterone that men have, estrogens that women have, and testosterone is what makes these guys all aggressive and whatever. We've already talked about a rhesus monkey study where they took a set of male rhesus monkeys, measured their testosterone level, and found that, yes, indeed, the most aggressive was indeed had highest testosterone level. And then they took this monkey, introduced him into another colony, and found that where this monkey was not actually the most aggressive, and so let it all sort out and found that this guy's testosterone level actually dropped. So there's correlation but not causality. Really, when you look at it, the whole relationship that human beings have with their biology as men or women, it's really more about the stories we tell about ourselves. The classic example of premenstrual syndrome. You know, we all know why women are a little bit testy right around their periods, because, you know, it's menstruation that's causing this. And women ourselves will say, I'm feeling a little down today, I must be premenstrual. It's actually biological changes that occur and fluctuations in hormone levels that occur to everybody at any point in time. And we just choose to pay attention to these things. There was an interesting study that was done of men and women, college-age students, and asked to rate their moods over a 60-day period, keep sort of a journal. And when they looked at this, what they found was that there were significant differences in terms of being happy and being depressed, but they correlated more with the day of the week than they correlated with where women and men were in their cycle. With more women reporting that they were happy and excited and elated on Fridays and the weekends, and depressed and upset on Wednesdays. They also, by the way, found out that men had more days when they reported feeling achy or sick or kind of crampy. So, no relationship to biology. The stories that we tell about our bodies become much more important. From infancy on, differences are reinforced through various mechanisms in society, whether it's our family, schools, toys, and you all are going to be engaging in an exercise where you go out and see just how pervasive the marketing and selling of toys is in determining and encouraging certain gendered characteristics. The media, all of these reinforce images of, quote, normalcy, and they all reinforce gender stereotypes. The book that you're going to be reading, the textbook, gives a lot of examples of how the agents of socialization reinforce these gender dichotomies. And I know for myself, raising a young daughter, I mean, even I find myself saying, "Oh, that's a beautiful dress you have on today," as opposed to reinforcing other sets of characteristics. There was a study that was done of the ways in which men and women dealt with babies. And they were handed a newborn baby, not told, were told one set were women and another set were men. And the people consistently described the babies that they were told were boys as bigger, as stronger, as tougher, and consistently described the girls as being weaker and more delicate. So you see, it starts from the early ages, and it's reinforced all the way through our socialization process. Even through advertising, images of the normal women are portrayed to us that take on certain characteristics. Now, what we find is that there are certain gendered stereotypes. We all know this, or at least are told this in our culture, that there are characteristics of masculinity, which tend to be the characteristics of instrumental characteristics, characteristics where guys are typically goal-oriented, work harder, strive to achieve goals set for themselves. And here we've got the picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger in his classic muscular portrayal. Now, this was before he got to be governor of California, and I actually suspect his image that's being promoted is much different than this. The classical stereotypes of gender in terms of femininity. We've got a picture of Britney Spears as a sort of stereotypical female, expressive, gentle, sensitive, submissive, nurturant, and there's all sorts of role models of these kinds of stereotypes. We're all aware of these kinds of stereotypes. But what's interesting about these is that we often don't play them out in the same ways. Studies done of children find that children dodge in and out of gender patterns. When they play with same-sex groups of people, they do act as stereotypical little boys and little girls. But when they play in intersex groups, they tend to take on, gender doesn't become so much more important. So we move in and out of gendered patterns. Other studies have shown that we agree on the characteristics of male and female, but we label ourselves differently. If I did a study and asked you to label what are the characteristics of masculinity, what are the characteristics of femininity, everyone would agree on these things. But when asked to describe yourself, the characteristics that you use to describe yourself are different. The real differences between men and women are far less than we pay attention to. Most studies will reaffirm this, and we tend to interpret our actions based on gendered stories. The important idea that you can take from this is that while there are specific stereotypes of gender, we don't all take them on in the same kinds of ways, and we oftentimes resist and go against these. There's a concept that I think is really important for you to understand, and that is the notion of hegemonic forms of masculinity and femininity. Hegemony simply means most powerfully enforced, or the most powerful form. So the hegemonic forms of masculinity and femininity are the forms of gender that are the most powerfully reinforced. They are the gendered stereotypes. They're the ones that we tend to take on most easily in terms of our identity, and they're the most strongly enforced in social institutions. They are what are considered the normal forms of gendered behavior. What's important about understanding this concept of gender is to see the idea that gender roles change over time. Gender roles vary across a lifetime with us. They vary in historical periods. What was a dominant form of gender in the 1950s is not the same kind of dominant form of masculinity or femininity that exists today. And you can see that very much in the way that masculinity is transformed from one movie back in the 1950s to a movie that we see today. So gender varies in time and place, historical period, among different social groups. It varies amongst races and ethnicities. And also, very importantly, we resist gender in important ways. In other words, while we are given all these images of what the ideal or the normal woman is, we oftentimes play against that. No, I'm not that typical woman. No, I'm not a girly girl. No, I'm not, a macho guy. But the fact of the matter is we define ourselves, even though we resist them, we define ourselves in and against them. And in many ways you can see alternative forms and resistant forms of hegemony that exist in the external world. So this last slide captures that. Gender changes over time. It changes across culture. And it varies by race, class, ethnicity, and age. And there are always alternative and resistant and subversive forms of gender. Next time, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the notion of patriarchy. Thanks.
If you are interested in any other UNLV distance education course, please call us at 702-895-0334.